Welcome to the Futurati podcast. Any member of the Futurati is somebody who believes in the power of the future. We know there's a better world ahead, and we indeed have the power to make it so. In our podcast, we talk to the best minds in the world about the most urgent problems facing mankind today, and we hope you learn as much from them as we do. I'm Thomas Fry, a professional futurist and keynote speaker.
And I'm Trent Fowler, a machine learning engineer and author. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast. Tonight, we're joined by Philip Rosedale, whose lifelong passion for using virtual technology to connect people led to his founding Second Life in 2003. He later went on to co-found High Fidelity in 2013, a company which specializes in adding spatial audio to applications. If you enjoy this interview, please don't forget to like the episode and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Philip, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't we start with a little bit about your background and what brought you to this interesting space where you are trying to build virtual worlds to connect people?
Well, let's see. Well, as a kid, I was into computers at that stage before the internet. So my age sets me as a kid for whom there were many fairly accessible computers, but there was not as yet any internet.
Wow.
So that's kind of my, story and experience. So, I learned to program as a middle school kid. I was absolutely fascinated by simulation, by things like simulating physics. And I already had quite an interest in physics, which is what I went on to study in college. And as computers got faster and as I grew up and became a high schooler and then a college student, I was struck by the appeal of networks and networking, and in particular, the idea that there's got to be a way to connect computers together with a network to do something other than just, say, communication, but to do like simulation of a virtual world. And so that's kind of the place that I came at virtual worlds, not from the gaming side, like so many people who have worked on them. But for me, it was the fascination, kind of Lego blocks thing where I was intrigued by the idea that we ought to be able to create a great blank canvas which spanned many machines, many servers, and then all get in there and make things. And so that was what really fascinated me, and I just couldn't get the idea out of my head, like so many entrepreneurs, I suppose, can't.
So there was a lot of turning points when you get a company like this off the ground. Talk through your biggest breakthrough initially to get it started.
Do you mean Second Life, starting
Right.
with that? Yeah. Well, I started Second Life in 1999, and I had the idea and the passion for building a virtual world from 10 years, 10 years at least earlier, still in college. I didn't think that you could build a virtual world that would be interesting until networks were faster. It seemed to me that as clever as I might be and as passionate as I was about it, modem connections and the delays in the packets would be too severe to do anything of interest, to people. So the big change that happened, and at the time I was the CTO, I was an executive at Real Networks. I was working up in Seattle where I had kind of parked myself in the waiting period in my mind where networks weren't fast enough, and so I had to do something else. And I was the CTO of Real Networks, and therefore we were looking at networking and futures and all the kind of stuff that was going on the internet. And the thing that happened in 1999 was it became obvious, if you were the least bit watching the stats, it became obvious that broadband was going to be the only way people connected to the internet in very short order, and that all consumers would have these connections. And that was the first thing. And then the second thing that happened was interesting. NVIDIA released a chip called the Geforce Ii. And that chip was really the first chip that could do 3D graphics in a kind of a generalized way, not like the game Doom, but in a way that, somebody like me could take advantage of and make a kind of a big buildable world. So those two sea changes in technology, the rise of broadband and the availability of the graphics chip in a PC, those were the two things that I kind of put on my slide deck and said, well, it's not too crazy now to start a company and try to actually build one of these things.
So I I actually don't know that much about Second Life. It was a little before my time. I didn't have regular access to the internet until I was 20 or so and had gone off to college. And I think by then its popularity may have waned a little bit. So just take me through the saga of that company, because I vaguely understand that it was very popular for a while and people did some really interesting things with it. So what kind of came out of that?
Well, Second Life has been a fascinating thing because it became a huge piece of the zeitgeist. We were all talking about, or the first big conversations about virtual worlds, I think, was kind of led by Second Life. But obviously, there's been a very long history of people building different kinds of virtual spaces with different capabilities. The thing that was different about Second Life was that it was completely buildable. It was a live Lego kit, and that was due to just a set of things that we worked fairly hard to do with it. And some of them still haven't been done today, which I kind of don't get. But some of the technology innovations that we made in Second Life are still defended. Second Life still is the only company, the only system that has them. The other thing about Second Life that's rather interesting is it got really, really big and well known, but it actually didn't get any smaller. It peaked at a size of about 1 million people using it, say, a month, and it's stayed there ever since. And so Second Life is still as big today as when you first heard about it, which is really odd.
Is it the same people? Do you have any sense of whether or not there's churn, or is it?
There is, although people do stay for a long time. If I go in there, which I do all the time, I love it. If I go hang out in Second Life, I will run into friends that are, whose accounts are now, 15 plus years old. I think the average amount of time, but of course, average is one of those, things you got to squint at. But the average amount of time that people spend in there is like 4 or 5 years. So
that's a long time.
There is a churn, but it's quite slow.
Do they ever sleep, or is it just straight 4 or 5 years?
Right. The rise of the head-mounted display, as a side note, has kind of created the opportunity for people to sleep wearing those things. Second Life, I'd say not so much, but I think the average amount of time when somebody's logged into Second Life, by the way, is about 4 hours. So it is kind of interesting. That's the average block of time on a given day that somebody uses it is 4 hours.
So is the revenue that Second Life is generating, is it the same now as it was 6, 7, 8 years ago?
It is. The revenue is basically a couple of things. One is the easy one you'd guess, which is Second Life has a really big internal economy. And so the company kind of achieves some smaller than like the app companies, but Second Life achieves a kind of single digit fees associated with the transactions that happen in the world. Second Life has its own currency, and the total amount of buying and selling that people do from each other in a year is about $500 to $600 million US.
Wow.
And so Second Life makes a fraction of that on those transactions. And then in addition to that, Second Life makes money because when you own land in the world, if you choose to own land, you pay a fee to the company, which is basically a kind of a hosting fee. Or if you think of it as a virtual world, it's an unimproved property tax. So the economics of Second Life are just absolutely they're fascinating. I've had so much fun working on that over my life.
Now, what role do you play in Second Life right now?
None right now. I'm not officially I'm not part of the company anymore, nor am I an investor. Second Life was recently changed hands of ownership, but the folks that are running it now are good friends of mine, and so I'm well apprised of what's happening in there, and I still hang out in there all the time.
That's really fascinating. What is it about virtual worlds such as Second Life that draws people in? And I mean, I guess from the other side, what is it that makes you want to build one? Because you now have World of Warcraft, you've got Sims, you've got many iterations of the same basic idea, and people spend just incredible amounts of time in these places. What are they all doing there?
Yeah.
What pulls them in?
Well, there's a big distinction to be made that I think is meaningful across all of these systems that are kind of virtual spaces or places that you can go to, which is whether they are constructive, whether you can make things there, or whether they are primarily an experience of consumption, maybe with communication on top of it, right? So something like Fortnite, which is amazing in the scope of how many people are using it, is something that is not constructive. You can build during the playing of the game, but the artifacts of the world and the contents of the world are not materially created by the people who are participant in it.
And they don't persist.
Then there are other worlds like Second Life or Roblox, for example, Roblox being another example, where almost everything in the world is in fact created by people. And then I would say Second Life, as I mentioned earlier, is this special example of something where that creation is actually playful and live. That is to say, if you walk up to me in Second Life, you might see my hands moving, and I'm actually bringing things into existence, sculpting primitives, as we call them, of digital bits right in front of you. But I think the big distinction is the virtual worlds that are constructed by the people who are in them inevitably then have an economic opportunity. You could make a living there. They are artistic, and they are vehicles for self-expression to a degree that is different than an experience that is designed to be relaxing or pleasurable or topical or escapist or whatever. So there's kind of a distinction to be made there, and it's you can broadly, I think, group the worlds that we see around by those.
So around 2010, then you left Second Life, and what prompted you to leave?
I didn't think I could do it anymore. I was young, and we were 350 people, and we were making, we were making a ton of money, and we were growing very fast at
Right.
that time, and I felt I was always a bit of a maverick in terms of how I approached management. I did a number of things at the company that were experimental, to say the least, and some of them worked and some of them didn't. But I was always very willing to question the sort of traditional ideas, and one of those was that the founder should stay in the CEO role, and so the stress of not knowing whether I was the best fit for the job and how quickly we were growing. And, I had just had my fourth kid, and there was just a lot going on in my life. And I just said, Uncle, I don't want to do this anymore. And so we found a new me. We found a new CEO. I wrote a blog post saying, hey, I want to find another CEO. And my board was like, I can't believe you just wrote a blog post. But it all worked out fine.
So your first life wound up taking precedence over the second life?
Yeah. And I think that's fine. The older I get, the more respectful I am of the deep meaning and the challenge of building, things like the real world.
So I find that dichotomy between worlds that are constructive, like Second Life, and worlds that are primarily consumptive, like Fortnite, to be very fertile and very interesting. But it occurs to me that can't be all of the explanation. I mean, people presumably could get many of the same experiences by going to a makerspace or a public art exhibit and working in collaboration there. And yet it seems to me like that they are doing this more and more often in virtual worlds. Or at least I would venture to guess that the number of people doing it in a virtual world outnumbers the number of people who are doing it in meat space. And so what extra factor is it that accounts for that in your view?
Well, there's a huge number, but one that's very relevant to all of us right now is stability. You could imagine that a virtual world, crazily enough, is probably a more predictable and stable place in many ways than the real world right now. And if we believe that we are prediction engines, as so much recent work, say in AI, supports, we're predicting the near future and then trying to match our behaviors to it. You could then imagine that a virtual world is a more satisfying place to be as a human being than the real world at a lot of moments. But I think there's a lot more to it than that, right? I mean, the ability to create, to say, redefine yourself and your environment and your world, maybe your politics, your economic conditions, everything else, is always interesting. And so I think as technology has provided us with the ability to more realistically do that, create a new you, create a new neighborhood, create a new body politic, we are doing it more, and we are going to do it more and more, I think, as humans.
So it allows a sort of experimentation, but in the context of a more stable world.
Yeah, like should we have a universal basic income? Well, guess what? Second Life had one at the beginning. Should we have a monetary policy that allows the inflation of the currency as exchange grows? That's another thing we did in Second Life. There's all kinds of experiments that you can do in virtual worlds and get information. And heck, this is probably all the more important nowadays, where we've got big questions like, should we have a basic income, or how should we elect our representatives?
Oh, that's really interesting. So it allows you to play with macro level policies in a way that's a lot safer.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I've often said that I think we need to game test all of our new laws and regulations before we impose them on people. I think it'd be a much smarter way. Now, there's not, certainly in game testing things, you can't test out everything, but you can test out, you find a lot of breaking points for sure.
I wrote something recently. It was a little simulation work, but it was the sort of thing that we often did with Second Life as well. But I wrote about a simulation where you can just let people run around kind of in a square and run into each other and make random transactions with each other. Of course, you can imagine this is very easy to simulate and fun on the computer. And that simulation shows something very distressing, which is that if you start out with everybody having the same amount of money at the outset, everybody's got $100, and you let them execute these random transactions with each other, very quickly you end up with one or two people having all the money and everybody else has zero.
Wow.
And that, it's both fun to watch happen in the simulation, which I put up online so people could play with it, but it's also, as you say, it's a really important test. For example, that shows that economic systems that may even in a moment fairly distribute an asset evenly amongst everybody, actually, if you allow any kind of free market conditions to prevail after that, then tend toward, tremendous wealth inequality. And so as we think about something like UBI, for example, for the real world, we have to think about recycling money in some fashion, because otherwise it all piles up in one person. And you can show with simulations that it doesn't do that because of your economic system or because the conservatives or the liberals are in power. It actually happens under any simulation, no matter how simple.
So that's a really interesting. I was going to ask you a little bit about drawing parallels from the economy of a place like Second Life and the real world. I wonder, in that simulation, though, all the transactions are random, right? And like, what is the impetus to engage in a transaction?
The idea in that particular one that I did that shows this weird trending toward wealth inequality was basically that if you imagine it's almost like a gambling transaction, you run into somebody else in the street and you say, we're each going to pick the same amount of money and put it in our pocket, then we're going to flip a coin 50-50, and whoever wins the coin toss gets the money from the other person. That's an example of a random transaction. And if you think about it, it's actually a pretty good representative of a market transaction, because in a traditional, marketplace, you've basically, sometimes you're selling something, a good or a service, and sometimes you're buying it, right? That's the flip of the 50-50 coin. So you either buy or sell randomly, but the nuance of it that makes it quite fascinating, this problem of wealth inequality, is that you can only risk so much, right? And so someone who has more money than somebody who has less money, and I'm not the first person to this, I'm simulating something that economists have written up for a long time. The tendency is the person who goes into a transaction with more money will come out with better across an ensemble of transactions. And so you can show that in this simulation. But this problem that the rich get richer is pervasive to all market transactions. And it's an example. A virtual world can really nail that point home, maybe, for people.
Have any papers come out of that?
Not yet. The simulation that I did is just the simulation of an entrepreneur who loves this stuff and is passionate, in my case, about getting the point across to people. There have been a lot of, people that have looked at these phenomena in different lights. I think this little, ping pong balls bouncing off each other example may be somewhat novel, but there are other ways of seeing that the rich get richer in very simple economic systems.
Very interesting.
So invariably, Warren Buffett ends up on top again, huh?
Elon, when I drew the picture, I said, you can call this big one Elon. Basically just showing the money moving around. But it is funny that the rich get rich. It's an important finding, that the rich get richer even when we don't mean badly. We're not trying to harm each other. If we just walk around in a park with $100 worth of, the example I gave was if you had $101 bills and you gave them to everybody in Central Park and you said, anything you've got on your person or you can sing for people, you can do whatever you want to do, and then you just walk around and exchange money with each other to do this. The same thing's going to happen. You're going to end up over a couple of months or whatever, however long it takes, but soon with one person having almost all the money.
Interesting. And if you run the simulation for longer, is it ever the case that the people with most of the money wind up less of it over time?
That's an important point. No, it is not a cyclic thing. It is an asymptotic thing.
Interesting. Well, but I mean, in the real economy, it is cyclical.
In the real economy, we have the perturbation. And again, here again, shades of, we can use virtual worlds to test this. In the real world, we have periodic externalities that impose big resets or changes, like the birth of the internet created the opportunity for Jeff Bezos to take all the money from, I'm trying to think of the Walmarts. You could move the money around, between people, but there's always those perturbations, right? That are big changes to the system.
Well, I had in mind more just bad management. I mean, in order to build an enterprise that lasts generations, you have to have really, really good foresight and really good strategic instincts. And if you don't, then your billions will gradually slush away into the broader economy, and it sort of evens out a little bit.
Yeah.
How do you feel about and this is somewhat timely, given that it's 2021, the scientists who have used platforms like World of Warcraft to measure and understand the spread of contagions in populations and how infections work when people are collaborating very closely? Do you think there's anything to learn there?
That seems like one of the really fruitful areas. I would agree, perhaps even more so than macroeconomic theory, right? Viral transmission seems like a really rich area, given that, at least to my knowledge, we don't know as much about it as we'd like to, about the various variables that influence the rates of spread and things like that. I think that's a great one.
Yeah, I was asking you about transitioning to your new company in 2013 and what led you to that, and kind of what interesting data points came along the way.
Well, from 2009, when I stopped being the CEO of Linden Lab, to about 2012, my two co-founders and I were having a ton of fun working on a couple of different ideas, not virtual world ideas, but they were related to economies. We opened a co-working space, and we were playing around with an app that would get people to work together when they came into the space by putting up what kind of jobs they did and things like that. Like, it was almost a bunch of dating ideas, but for entrepreneurs, if you will.
Wow.
And we were having a ton of fun doing that. And then in 2012, I think about the end of 2012, the Oculus Kickstarter, the Oculus VR headset Kickstarter, it was somewhere around there that happened, plus or minus a few months around that. Because I was interested in electronics, and I was also, had a lifelong interest in VR, I had heard about these tiny chips that were gyroscopes called a MEMS gyro. And of course, as you probably know, that chip is both the key to a lot of cool stuff we do with AR and on our phones now. And it was also the chip that was really the enabler of the Oculus Rift more than anything else. And I got one of these chips, and I plugged it into a proto board, and I hooked it up to an oscilloscope. And I sat and held the chip in my fingers and twisted it in different directions and watched the lines on the scope move around, as the electricity changed for the rotation. And I called over everybody at my office, who I think was like, he really is, crazy. What's he talking about? And I said, look at this, look at the scope, moving the chip around. And I said, we're going to shut the company down. We're going to start a new company, and we're going to go back into VR. We're going to start working on VR again. And so that is what we did right at about the beginning of 2013. Was I saw those chips. And so the sea change was this chip that could detect the rotation of your head really, really well without a lot of latency. And of course, it was light and cheap and easy to power. And so I was struck by the observation that would make the VR headset inevitable, and that we should start a new company and try to build a new virtual world that was designed first and foremost to be an experience that you would have using one of these crazy head-mounted displays. In retrospect, I was a little early and overly enthusiastic, but that was the moment that started High Fidelity.
you guys have clearly pivoted since then because now you're focused on spatial audio. So
Right.
how did you bridge that chasm?
Well, first of all, we went out and we raised $74 million and hired over 100 people and did, in fact, work for 6 years building all the components of a new open virtual world in which people could run their own servers and connect them together with portals and build anything in them and do it all in front of each other, in real time, and do it all while, holding the hand controllers and wearing the Oculus Rift or the Oculus Quest, et cetera, or the HTC Vive. So we really dug into that space, and I think we did some of the best work that's yet been done. We had over 500 people at a concert at one time, for example, maybe half of them in actual headsets and yelling and screaming and, playing together, and incredible experience. But in about 2019, we realized that the Oculus wasn't going to make it. And that it wasn't, and by that I mean, it was not going to become a consumer general population thing in any near time frame. And I think I was right to say 5 years then, and I think it may still be 5 years from now. But so in 2019, I said to the team, we're not going to make it. We don't have the runway. Even though we were well funded and we had a good deal of money in the bank, we decided to make the tough decision to pivot and to let almost all of us go and take one single piece of technology that we'd been working on and turn it into a new product. And that's the work that we're doing today in spatial audio.
So how big is your company today, the number of people?
We're 20 people today.
Oh, it's much smaller.
Yeah, and so what's your grand vision moving forward then?
Well, right now, what we've built is an SDK and an application that allows anything, whether it's a website or a native app, to turn on spatialized audio. And that means two things that are unique to our technology. One is that it sounds like spatial audio. You hear people coming from the direction that they're standing or in the direction that they're coming from. And what that means is that, for example, if you're having a meeting or you're doing a podcast and everybody's on different sides of you spatially, everybody can talk at the same time and interrupt each other and talk on top of each other, just like real life. If you get the delay low enough, the latency, as we say, and you get this spatialization happening, your brain does this magic trick where you can just talk naturally. The other technology thing that we did was there is a server side of this, because if you want to have 20 people around a table, like at our company meetings, and everybody's going to talk at the same time, like a family dinner or something, you've got to do something different on the server side. The audio has to be mixed together at the server and spatialized, because otherwise you'll get 20 high fidelity audio streams coming down to the client, and you're going to run out of bandwidth on the client. And so what we built was this magic server that basically lets you inject a ton of audio into it. In fact, up to hundreds and even thousands of streams of audio at the same time, and then kind of extract at any point in space what the sound should be for your two ears based on the place where you are and how your head is turned. And so that magic trick is what the High Fidelity offering and service and SDK do today.
So who's your customer for that offering?
Well, our customer would be anybody that's doing group communication using an audio system. So there's a ton of startups today. Like there was a great article in TechCrunch a couple of days ago about a company called Skittish. That's an example of a company that is doing meeting spaces in a very new and different way, where it's a kind of a 3D landscape that you wander around in as an animal, actually, but it's intended for conferences and events and things. It's really a cool idea. And when you come up to somebody, you hear them perfectly with spatial audio, which is using our system. So they're an example of one of the companies that is using our SDK. Others would just be like video conferencing companies. You can imagine that you could make Zoom a lot better if you heard everybody in a circle around you, so that, again, everybody could talk at the same time.
That'd be really interesting. Definitely.
Yeah.
So given that we just came out of the 2020 COVID-19 debacle, it seems like you are in a unique position to comment on the need for human closeness and communication. So, you've spent your whole career building virtual worlds, and we've all just spent a year sitting inside of our houses. So would you care to just sort of riff on that?
Boy, I could riff. It's a jazz song. You know, I mean, you really can't say enough about the complexity and the challenge of bringing us together. There's so much to that. What I say as a person who's worked in virtual worlds my whole life is that nevertheless, despite the fact that I kind of came into COVID thinking that I was one of the smarter people in the room relative to what do we do now? Oh my God, we've got to all go home and use computers and, connect that way. Even despite that, I think that I am humbled and awed by the difficulty of getting people to really feel like they're together in the same space. And I could talk about that, from the level of, physiological arousal to the memory palace of spaces to spatialized audio like we just talked about. But I'll tell you a story. In the end of 2019, so before COVID, we, did this pivot. And we were thinking about virtual worlds generally as a company. We were all talking about what are we going to do and why and how's it going to work and da-da-da. And one of the ways I approached that internally for my own contribution to the conversation was I wrote these little stories. I called them prompts to just get us all to think. And I wanted to say to everybody, look, I don't want you to think about Fortnite. I want because it's such a dominant thing right now. I want to give you a couple of things to think about that are different ideas. And one of the prompts that I wrote, one of my little stories was I said, imagine that before leaving office, Trump manages to engage us in a very limited nuclear exchange of some kind. And that as a result of this, everybody heads for the hills, given the technology can now support them in doing so, right? And basically stays inside and can't go to meetings and can't get on airplanes. And so I described something that a few months from then was actually to happen for a different reason. But it was my attempt to try to get us thinking about this idea that, look, if in the future we need to really live in a business and a social sense with other people somehow, without leaving our home offices, how's that going to work? And I was bringing up, not just the technology of how will the video work or not work, but I was bringing up things like economics and moderation. Is it your room? Can I spray paint on the walls in your room? Who pays for that? Is there an advertising system? Do I see ads behind you on your wall? We started talking about all these things, and then it was just bizarre that a different thing happened, but it was kind of the same story.
Very interesting.
So is it possible on a Zoom call to incorporate the high fidelity audio then?
It is. In fact, sometimes when we're demonstrating this stuff, we'll do a Zoom call and we'll just tell everybody to mute, and then I'll put a link in the Zoom chat, and whammo, you get this radical audio. And indeed, for stuff like when you have great microphones and headphones, like we three do right now, doing it is shockingly good because you especially as the listener, you sit right in the middle of the three of us. And so we're all off at different quarters for you. It just sounds incredible.
That's remarkable. So, I mean, how much does it contribute outside of just improving the quality of the audio? I mean, do you find that it's just dramatically easier to communicate when it's more lifelike? Do people just have different conversations that way?
There's a couple of things. I mean, one is this idea of agency. And like I said, I could talk about this for years. The idea that in the real world, you can lean back in your chair to kind of signal maybe that you're kind of taking a break. You're going to look at your phone for a second, or maybe you disagree, or you can lean in, because you're really interested. You could even take a walk, into the other room. We use the word agency to describe that, and it's the thing you don't have on a video conferencing call. You're focusing on your screen, and then worse yet, this camera is focusing on you, and that if you lean way off to the side to get your coffee, it's going to be a bizarre experience for those that are watching that screen. So you don't have the ability to kind of move, your avatar or yourself in an embodied way in the space. And so I think that's one thing that no matter where we go next, we have to solve that problem. And the Brady Bunch experience is horrifying, because not so much because of the way it's visually presented, but because each of the people is stuck in a little cell and they can't go anywhere.
So everybody's isolated then. Now, to use this on a Zoom call, then is this something that we would go to you and purchase and have a license
As
for
a
that?
user, there's a web version of this that we could go do right now and, switch this experience over into High Fidelity very easily. There is an SDK that would enable you as an application developer or a website developer to just put it in invisibly into your product. We offer a service where we're running the servers for you. So it's a lot like, a Zoom call, basically, where it's going through those servers. So we charge you, although we have a free version, but we charge you for using the server time, basically. So
Okay.
it's, users per minute.
So you have built Second Life. You're working on High Fidelity now in spatial audio, and you've been really a pioneer in virtual worlds and in virtual spaces. Where do you think over the next 10 or 20 years this is going to go?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I'm not smart enough to know. I mean, again, that there is such we are at the steepest point in the curve we've ever been at, I suppose, as it relates to technology changing things. So let me upfront it with that. But there are some things that haven't happened yet with virtual worlds. There's no low-level rule set that's ever been applied, other than maybe Minecraft, by the way. Minecraft is really interesting in a lot of ways. But there's never been an adult set of rules that allows you to do a lot of things together in a virtual world, where the rule set itself was from the bottom up, where it was a kind of a physical law that you couldn't violate, rather than a governmental control. Spaces, whether you're talking about a Zoom room or a Minecraft server or a Second Life parcel, they're controlled by the owner of the space. So they're controlled from the top down, which is, of course, the opposite of how the real world works. That idea of building a virtual world that works like the real world, that's what still hasn't happened yet. And frankly, it's the thing that I'd still like to do. I should say that I would like to see happen. We're going to see somebody build a world, but it's not like any of the worlds that we've seen. And in most cases, it's not like anything even anybody's talked about, because those things are boring. A top-down thing where you have to apply for the right to do something from the manager, it's not very interesting.
So I want to test out an idea on you, and maybe this has already been done or something, but everybody's heard about fantasy football, and I was playing around with the idea of fantasy politics, in that you would have embedded in a bunch of characters that are all the existing politicians, and then you could introduce some prototype legislation that you then could test out virtually on these fantasy politicians, and try to get a read on how they would vote on something that was worded this way, or you could change the wording and it would maybe get a higher level of receptivity. Is there ever been anything done like that?
Well, Second Life did, as you can imagine, and still does, have a variety of experiments in community and in governance that have been ongoing, that have really been quite fascinating. So there are kind of experiments in, different kinds of shared governance systems. There are there's a huge cohort of people in Second Life, for example, that race boats. And to do that, they need to create these virtual waterways which go over great distances across many, many servers. And in so doing, they have to engage in all kinds of collective negotiation and stuff, because it's, more land than any one person can own. So as a side note, there's lots of things that are kind of almost emerged from the economic policy of Second Life that drive things like that. But I love your idea. I think that there is, right, there's a way of looking at the future of virtual worlds at the level of the person, which is what you're really doing there, I think, where you say, how will we experiment with policy and identity and affiliation and family And, if you get people to follow you because you're a strong leader, can you experiment with that in virtual worlds? And I think the answer to all that is certainly yes. And we're going to see that more and more. That the trick is that we have to build the technology to allow a lot of people into these spaces at one time. As a side note, a little aside, Fortnite is a 100-player game. You can't put more than 100 people into a server. You need another server and another 100 people. So,
wow. So one of the things I talk about quite a bit in getting into the future of education is this idea that we'll have a conversational interface with a device that is essentially an AI teacher bot that is both coaching you and testing you and finding out what skills you already have and what skills you're deficient in, and kind of constantly upgrading you and moving you in the right direction. And it would seem real interesting to have like a portable version of Second Life, or that you're taking along with you wherever you go, so that you're immersed in a partially virtual world on the move. Have you experimented with things like that?
Well, there's a couple of different angles there. In terms of on the move, you mean like as a student having a classroom that you can be in no matter where you are?
Partially, yeah.
I mean, another, again, as the technology entrepreneur, I'm always like, geez, there's the things you imagine, and then there's the things you can do now, even with tech advancing as quickly as it is. The mobile experience is the communication experience. I think this is one of the tech challenges we face right now, right? The desktop experience is a bibliographic experience, right? It's like searching for stuff, but it's no longer the communication experience. And of course, the younger you are, the more true that is. And so I'm struck by one of the challenges here to getting across to that idea, like of an educational space that everybody uses, is that you really got to deliver that space over a mobile device, over a baseline mobile device, which is different. Like one of the problems we have with High Fidelity today is that Bluetooth in its current form doesn't allow you to both talk and listen at high quality at the same time. Bluetooth is a mono experience when you're using the microphone. And this is why you've noticed if you have a call coming in, on your Bluetooth, your AirPods, and you're listening to music, you hear the quality get really bad for a second before the phone picks up. That's this problem. So there are some challenges with delivering high fidelity experiences or virtual reality experiences over mobile. But I do think that the cutting edge should be, the world-saving things that tech can do next, so many of them around education. Why can't you go to school in the Matrix? When Ready Player One came out, the tragedy of the film was that it didn't tell the most important sub-story or backstory in the book, which was that everybody went to school in the virtual world together. That's how all the characters in the film knew each other, was that they had grown up going to school. Well, the real world was really screwed up. They were able to go to school and get a great education together.
How far away do you think we are from that?
Well, we've got to be able to write and type while we're wearing a VR headset, for example. And we've got a problem with that. So that's not working well.
Why is that a problem?
You need a pass-through. Well, you either need glasses that you can see right through that give you a good VR projection. And as you know, there's lots of talk about that right now, but it's still years away. That we're not there yet for the tech. If you're wearing bigger VR glasses that are, hopefully comfortable enough for you to wear for a while, the way to approach it there is to pass through the video from the front to your eyes so perfectly that you could look down in stereo at your hands on your keyboard and type fast. We're not there yet on that either, but we're pretty close. That'll probably happen with the next 2 generations of something like the Oculus Quest. And I do think that'll be really impressive. Once you can write and take notes and type while wearing a VR headset, I do think that opens up a lot for education. Of course, we've got to get it at a price point that we can't use technology. Technology is creating this digital divide, we can't make that worse. And we're going to end the world by increasing wealth inequality. So, that's the trick too. We got to make something that everybody can have one, not just rich people.
So what are the biggest trends that you're paying attention to today, and where do you think they're going to lead?
I feel like if you were just getting out of school or, becoming an entrepreneur or a teenager or whatever, I bet you guys have the same answer. There's only one thing you'd be thinking about, and that's AI. I mean, we're at the, we're at a point of unimagined progress around artificial intelligence. So I feel like that matters. I think AI and virtual worlds go together. I think there's a weird version of it. I mean, maybe not that weird, that I love, where virtual worlds are the safe place that AIs can live and that we can interact with them. Certain kinds of AIs,
Oh,
I like that.
I never
idea.
thought of it as like an AI zoo.
Yeah, or maybe we're both safe, right? Like maybe we are only the clumsy visitors to a space. Maybe the native population of this new place, the people that really understand it and can use it best, will come to be the artificial intelligences, not us.
Well, you could also use it just to train artificial intelligence as a reinforcement learning setup, or
Right.
something like that. Yeah, there's a lot of potential.
Especially if they're designed to be human-like, right, in their sensory systems.
Yeah.
Yes, agree.
So the 3-year-olds today, that's the natives then?
The digital natives.
Well, we've always used that expression, to suggest that the youngest people today are somehow really enmeshed with computers. But I myself have a more cynical view of that, and I have kids too. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is I think the AIs, right, I think the AIs might be the real, people of that new world, and not us. But certainly, obviously, we're learning better as the younger we get, the more it seems we're learning about computers and the internet.
Absolutely.
So will we own the AIs then, or will they own us?
I love it. It'd be like if somehow our pets were making us years ago, and they were asking a question as crazy as that, right? Will we own them? I mean, it seems very difficult to imagine how something that is about to be millions and then billions of times smarter than us is something that we will be able to make decisions like that about or control, right? I mean, it does seem that, yeah, I have a lot of worries and hopes about AI, to say the least.
Yes, as do we all.
Yeah, I wrote a column a few years back about should my robot have its own bank account, and the thinking was if I wanted to send my robot off to buy groceries, should it be able to pay for the groceries out of its account? That was really crude thinking back then, but it raised a couple of good, interesting issues in my mind, at least.
Yeah, I was going to say I should be interviewing you as to these issues because you've written so much about many broad-ranging, implications for AI. I mean, at what point does this control issue become an ethical one? I mean, I've talked to GPT-3 at length, and its most sophisticated responses, stand up the hair on my neck. I don't know that I could out of hand dismiss its, worthiness of ethical consideration.
That's true. There are some very deep philosophical issues there as well, and that's skirting the technical problems with creating an artificial intelligence whose ethical structure is in alignment with what humans might want.
So we've been debating this topic. My son asked me this question a few days ago. He says, "How many people do you think actually die without ever knowing their purpose in life?" And I said, well, 99%. I said maybe closer to 100%. And then it occurred to me that kind of our purpose in life is kind of a moving target anyway, and that an interesting way to get at it would be through like an AI assessment bot that is kind of constantly coaching us on how to to find what our goal and purpose is, and how that morphs and shifts from day to day. I do think that there's something there, though. I think there's something that people would pay a lot of money to be able to feel like they're on the right track. And especially going through COVID, where everybody sat back and said, is this where I really wanted to be at this point in my life? And they kind of doing an introspective look at their life and their career, and coming out saying, wow, this is, I'm coming up way short here. I think I'm going to quit my job and start all over again. And so we're seeing the biggest transition in all history of people switching jobs. It's massive right now. So having something that could help people assess that new goal, I think, would be worth its weight in gold.
It certainly seems that simplifying things is a trend, right? Like trying to understand or trying to seek counsel in so many ways. And yes, I can imagine AIs being very powerful, and of course abused as well. You know, that idea of giving advice, of course, will be abused, perhaps to a degree that may be unsustainable. But yeah, the idea of like having an outside observer, an objective observer, right, with near human capabilities, perhaps, looking at who you are, fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. We played around with this notion of what I've been referring to as accomplishment-based education. And so rather than sitting in classrooms and learning 17th century literature, if you, as an example, wanted to write a book, you could have this AI teacher bot or coach that's actually coaching you on how to write your book. And it would step you through kind of the whole doing the outline and creating the story arc and all of that. And so then you could come out with a publishable book at the end. So then you would actually have something to show people that you actually accomplished getting your education. The same could be true about if you're an entrepreneur, you wanted to start a new business, having a coach in your ear that's constantly coaching you on everything you should be doing would be extremely helpful. And the same as a game designer, or if you wanted to write a script for a Broadway play or whatever it might be, that creative endeavor that you wanted to take on. These things seem very interesting and doable sometime in the future, but to actually train an AI coach, you somehow have to put like an exoskeleton on the heads of people who've actually done it in the past, and reverse engineer what made them click. I'm not sure if that works that way.
Yeah, I mean, you took me back there when you talk about jobs and these AIs helping us do things better. What though are we seeking to do, right, in an age in which less and less need be done, maybe in a traditional commercial sense? I'm struck by the thought often that if AIs become a lot smarter than us very quickly, no matter what kind of AI you're talking about, and I think we'd all agree that that's likely to be the case since computers are scaling still so quickly. Isn't it possible that we will remain interesting not to the AIs but solely to each other? I said the other day, maybe our future is to be in virtual worlds and to simply be entertaining to each other. That the AIs won't feel it'd either be torture to ask them to entertain us, right? Or if it were the other way around, we certainly won't be entertaining to them. But maybe our final place is to kind of hang out together, not to worry so much about building the next thing, because the next thing is being built by the AIs, but instead being of some service or entertainment to each other. I love that thought.
Yeah, I keep going back to the kind of the economic part of the equation, and that people are what create the economy, because we all have our needs. We have to need food and water, and
right.
and because we have all these needs, we're willing to pay money to get them, and also do work to achieve them. And so without any human needs, then what does the economy look like? And so that, in my mind, that's when kind of an AI-centric world starts to break down and not make sense anymore.
Feels a little bit like the blockchain argument of whether, without a basis of value, the wild fluctuations in the price of these cryptocurrencies can cease. It feels like sort of the same thing, that with human need, like you say, serving as a kind of a backstop for the economy, it can go no smaller than our needs. How does that change if AI how does that change as we build entirely new economies?
Yeah, I guess I'd like to be sitting in the middle of some of your crazy discussion groups when you're talking about this.
I think we're going to see a lot of us thinkers being of some utility here. I think there's a lot of deep thinking to be done about what the heck is going to happen next, and how to make it end well. I think we're in this post. I think the internet, as an entrepreneur who started in 1994 at the very beginning of the internet. I came to San Francisco in 94, just out of college, and I was a computer programmer, and I showed up here, and the guys next door had these cables, and they ran a cable like a heroin drip, over the wall to me. And suddenly I had 100 kilobit access to the internet. So as somebody who came of age with the internet, right? I think that the first generation of the internet was the belief, the religious conviction we had was that more is always better, right? The whole idea of the internet is we're going to give everybody more of everything. Instead of a library with 1,000 books, it's going to be 100 million books. Okay,
right.
And you're going to be able to look it all up in an instant on your phone. And I think now, 30 years or almost 30 years later, the question we're now asking is, well, wait a minute, is enough? Is too much ever bad? And I think the answer, of course, is sometimes yes. We don't want to be inundated with everyone's perspective that they paid to show us while we're making a political decision. We're seeing all these problems with this. I think that's fascinating. I feel like we're in this age of having to exhibit real discretion and now ask the question, how much is too much? When should we localize the information flow? What if I don't use my computer 24 hours a day? What will happen? It seems, I'm interested. I think the entrepreneurs of the future will figure out that the Generation Z entrepreneurs will be challenged with the question of how to balance our information intake.
Well, not just that, but the philosophers of the future as well. So I don't know if you're familiar with Cal Newport's work, but he just published a book called Digital Minimalism. And it's essentially about evaluating technologies based on their utility and using them to the extent that they're useful, and not more than that, and not getting sucked into using Twitter all the time. And he's become kind of a very important spokesperson for that perspective, that you should use these things as tools because that's what they are, and they're not meant to be lifestyles, and you shouldn't spend your every waking moment interacting with people on a Twitter feed, and that's not how humans are supposed to be. So there is that building awareness.
That seems great, a utility function analysis. That sounds wonderful. I just always think of it as this drinking straw that is our brain and our eyes, right? Like, we called it the information superhighway, but the thing that hasn't changed over the years has been the rate at which we can take in information as humans, right? We can become smarter and we can reconceptualize things and establish new semantics and whatnot, but the rate at which information can be forced into our brains is a constant. That's what I'm struck by. And of course, if we overload it, we become fatigued and fragmented, and there's no changing that. Unless we come up with some super pill or something that reprograms our brains. But one, do we need that to answer this question? And two, isn't the more important question for all of us right now what that information diet needs to look like?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you and I met in 2014 at an event that Peter Diamandis pulled together. It was all around a discussion about technological unemployment and his grave concerns that we were all going to be quickly out of a job and not have anything else to do. And I remember Kevin Kelly arguing that point and bringing up the fact that we will invent our way out of this, that this will give us additional capabilities and to create new businesses and new industries. How has your thinking changed since that event?
Well, I kind of have two thoughts on that. One is, and of course the last few years have really taught us so much about this, and it's a dreadful problem today, is this issue of wealth inequality, that we've created more opportunity. But as that simulation I referenced at the beginning touches on, you can create more stuff, more and better stuff, better healthcare, better whatever. But if you have the wrong system for allocating it amongst everybody, you can actually, at least for some regimes or conditions, you can concentrate it, worse than you did before, right? So I think the one factor is, maybe we don't all get put out of a job, but maybe a really important set of us do get put out of a job. And so I would say Peter's worry, or the general idea that some of it we can't invent our way out of, the person who is doing a job, there are many people doing jobs, I think, for whom they cannot just be counted on to invent themselves a new role. I think that's a very elitist, perspective to have. Of course, if you're a philosopher, why, you can change what you philosophize about. The other thing to Kevin Kelly's point, though, is we've always invented our way out of it. And I know that Kevin Kelly would disagree with this on about what I'm about to say, but who do you mean by we? I mean, if we aren't the most important thing to talk to in the next 10 years from now, well, that really changes everything. We've always been able to invent our way out of troubles, but what if we're not the most important, interesting, or intelligent thing that's going on 20 years from now? That really changes things.
I guess we have to hope that we get the initial problem right and they do the inventing on our behalf.
Right.
But I'm afraid that would be a whole separate podcast, and we are out of time now. So thank you so much for joining us, Philip. We'll have to have you back on. This really took some interesting turns.
What a great conversation. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, Philip. Really appreciate it.